If I told you that the world's most powerful institutions don't just respond to financial crises, but quietly shape them long before they ever make headlines, you might shrug it off as another dramatic theory. But over the last 30 days, I went down a rabbit hole almost no one dares to explore: the internal playbook of central banks. Not the public statements, not the press conferences, not the official textbooks that have been softened over decades. I mean the real history, the forgotten meetings, the early policy experiments, and the long chain of decisions that transformed money from something tangible into something almost mythical. And somewhere along the way, one truth kept resurfacing: central banks learned how to control economies, without most people ever realizing they were being controlled. Welcome back to Historic Finance Lab, where we uncover the hidden forces shaping money, power, and the world we live in. Today, I'm breaking down the dark truth I discovered after 30 days of studying central bank secrets: how they learned to manage economies without accountability, without transparency, and without the limits they once feared. And to understand that truth, we need to rewind to a moment when the modern financial world was born almost by accident. The official story is simple: central banks were created to bring stability. But the deeper story shows a more complicated truth, one where stability wasn't the only goal, and sometimes wasn't even the main one. That story begins in 1910 on Jekyll Island, where a handful of America's wealthiest financiers met privately, not to plot a takeover, as myths suggest, but to redesign a financial system they believed had become dangerously unstable. There were no fake names or spy movie theatrics. But the secrecy surrounding the meeting reveals just how sensitive the project was. Their task was unprecedented: create an institution powerful enough to stabilize the banking system, yet independent enough to avoid political manipulation. 4 years later, their work became the Federal Reserve. The world didn't realize it, but this was the moment money began to change from a fixed, predictable object into a flexible tool of national policy. Central banks weren't creating control yet, but they had created influence. And influence always grows. By the mid-20th century, the global economy was shifting. Money still had an anchor. World War II shattered that anchor. Nations were bankrupt, exhausted, and desperate for a monetary system that allowed rapid rebuilding. So in 1944, 44 countries met at Bretton Woods to rewrite the rules. The solution was elegant, but flawed. All currencies would tie themselves to the US dollar, and the dollar would tie itself to gold. On paper, it looked stable. In practice, it quietly handed extraordinary power to the US central bank. Because if every currency depended on the dollar and the dollar depended on gold, then the institution managing the dollar had leverage over the entire system. But there was a mathematical problem. The world needed more dollars, but US gold reserves weren't growing fast enough. This tension, known as the Triffin dilemma, slowly broke the system. By 1971, foreign governments were demanding gold faster than the US could supply it. Under pressure, President Nixon severed the dollar's final link to gold. Money became something new, a concept backed not by metal, but by trust. And in this new world, central banks gained a different kind of power. They could influence money supply, steer interest rates, and increasingly guide economic cycles. It wasn't yet control, but it was the architecture of it. Then came the 1970s and 80s, a period of inflation so severe it threatened the social fabric. Oil shocks, wage spirals, double-digit inflation. It wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a crisis of confidence. For the first time, a central bank realized it had the authority to shock an economy back into stability. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates so aggressively that borrowing became a luxury. From that point forward, the world began to see central banks not just as financial managers, but as economic firefighters. Countries granted them increasing independence, believing only an insulated institution could make painful but necessary decisions. And independence is where real power hides. Because an institution that can influence the economy without facing voters plays by different rules. Central banks were in leading the rescues directly. The IMF was but central bankers' coordinated policy responses behind the scenes, shaping the tempo and tone of global stabilization efforts. And then came 2008. The financial crisis didn't just threaten banks, it threatened the entire global system. Instead of watching the collapse unfold, central banks acted with unprecedented force. Trillions in liquidity injections, emergency lending facilities, near-zero interest rates, quantitative easing where central banks bought government bonds and mortgages at massive scale. These tools weren't temporary, they became standard. The side effect was unavoidable. Central banks became some of the most influential financial actors in the world. Not by conspiracy, not by secret plan, but because every crisis pushed more responsibility onto them until they became the default problem solvers for global finance. This is the quiet truth. Central banks didn't seize power. They absorbed it because no one else could act fast enough. But this created a long-term tension. When one institution becomes the firefighter, the architect, the emergency room, and the insurance company of the financial world, it becomes impossible to imagine the system without it. Today, the pattern is unmistakable. Whenever growth slows or markets panic, central banks reach for the same set of tools. Lower interest rates, provide liquidity, buy assets, stimulate borrowing, and calm markets. And it works at first. But cheap money creates bubbles, housing, stocks, government borrowing, corporate debt. And when those bubbles wobble, central banks stabilize them. When they burst, central banks patch them. And when the patch creates new distortions, the cycle starts again. This isn't conspiracy, it's structural dependence. Consider global debt, over $300 trillion and rising. No country wants all of it repaid at once. It would collapse the system. So the world rolls it over, refinances it, and expands it. And the institutions that make that possible are the central banks. They manage the instability their own tools sometimes amplify. Because the alternative is complete collapse. That is the real dark truth, not corruption, not secret agendas. Dependence. Now the world is entering a new transition. Interest rates are rising, governments are straining, banks are under stress, currencies are adjusting, technology is accelerating. Not crypto, not decentralized, not anonymous. Faster, cheaper, more programmable, and more visible. This isn't the end of money. But it is the next stage of central bank influence, where economic guidance isn't only done through interest rates, but through the design of money itself. After 30 days studying the history, mistakes, and quiet transitions of central banks, 3 truths became unavoidable. First, central banks don't simply react to the economy. They shape the environment in which the economy operates. Second, money is no longer a thing, it's a policy instrument. And whoever steers that instrument influences everything built on top of it.